You already know the word. It's right there. And then it isn't. That half-second gap, the one that didn't used to exist, is now showing up in the middle of sentences, in the middle of conversations, in the middle of thoughts you've had 100 times before. She almost didn't schedule the cognitive screening, not because she wasn't worried, but because she was almost certain she already knew what it would show. Then her neurologist went quiet for several seconds when he saw the number. Not the kind of quiet that means he's thinking, the kind that means he doesn't have an explanation. The MoCA score had jumped more than 4 points in 60 days. No new medication, no therapy program, one thing, every morning, before breakfast. Doctors don't use the word impossible. When one does, something real happened that their training didn't prepare them for. I'm Dr. Anika Mehta, and that result is what sent me back into the research. What I found has nothing to do with what most people think memory supplements do. The mechanism is something almost no one is talking about, and it starts in a part of your brain that most doctors have never once measured. Most cognitive screenings are designed to catch a problem after it's already serious. By the time a MoCA score drops into concerning territory, the underlying damage has been accumulating for years, sometimes a decade. The test doesn't show you the process, it shows you the result of a process that's been running quietly the whole time. Here's what that process looks like at the structural level. Your brain produces metabolic waste constantly. Every time a neuron fires, every time you process a thought, cellular byproducts are generated. Amyloid fragments, tau proteins, inflammatory debris. You've probably heard those names in the context of Alzheimer's research, and yes, their accumulation is destructive. But most explanations stop there, and that's exactly where the important part gets left out. The question isn't just what the waste is. The question is why it accumulates in the first place. Here's what most people miss. Your brain has a dedicated waste clearance system called the glymphatic system. It runs through channels alongside your blood vessels, using cerebrospinal fluid to flush metabolic debris out of brain tissue and drain it away. Think of it as a pressurized cleaning network running through every corridor of the building, pushing waste out through the walls and into a drainage system below. Here's the part most people don't know. That system does roughly 90% of its work during deep, slow-wave sleep. Not during the day. Not when you're resting on the couch. During the specific, deep stages of sleep, your brain enters in the early part of the night, when the interstitial space between cells actually expands, and the cerebrospinal fluid can move through more efficiently. After 60, two things start to happen simultaneously, and they compound each other. Deep sleep shortens, and the glymphatic system becomes less efficient even during the sleep it does get. The cleanup crew still shows up, but the building is harder to clean, the shift is shorter, and the debris left behind each morning is slightly more than the morning before. That accumulation doesn't announce itself as memory loss at first. It announces itself as the half-second pause before a name surfaces, the sentence that loses its thread mid-thought, the fog that lingers past 9. These aren't signs of aging in the vague, inevitable sense most people accept them as. They are specific symptoms of a clearance system that can't finish its job overnight. The woman whose MoCA score stopped her neurologist cold described exactly those symptoms before her screening. Not dramatic, not disabling. Her doctor told her to stay mentally active. That's not a treatment, that's a placeholder. What her doctor didn't measure, And what almost no physician measures in a standard cognitive workup is the efficiency of the glymphatic system itself. There's no standard test for it in a clinic, no blood panel, no quick screen. The tools to assess it exist in research settings, but they haven't moved into routine care. So the system that may be failing you overnight goes unchecked. The waste accumulates. The MoCA score eventually reflects what's been happening for years. And the conversation about why and what can actually be done about the mechanism rather than the symptoms never happens. That changes now. The glymphatic system runs its deepest work overnight. That's already established, but it doesn't simply switch off the moment you open your eyes. The sleep-wake transition is its own distinct phase, and what happens in that window determines whether you use the brain's most neurologically receptive period of the day, or unknowingly close it off before it can do anything. In the last stretch before waking, the brain begins shifting out of its deep clearance cycles. Cerebrospinal fluid movement slows. The interstitial channels start to narrow back toward their waking state dimensions. For roughly the first hour after you open your eyes, the brain is completing its final drain cycle, processing the last of what the overnight clearance system moved but hasn't yet fully expelled. Think of it less as the brain powering up, and more as the brain finishing a job it started while you slept. Interrupt that process, and the debris it was clearing stays behind. At almost the same time, something else is happening hormonally. Cortisol begins rising about 20 minutes after waking and peaks somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes in. This is the cortisol awakening response, and it's not a stress signal, it's a priming signal. That morning cortisol peak is what prepares the brain for neuroplasticity. It's the window during which synaptic consolidation is most active, when the brain is most receptive to structural input, when the right kind of signal has an outsized effect compared to any other time of day. Two processes, running simultaneously, both peaking in the same narrow window. The glymphatic system finishing its clearance cycle, and the cortisol awakening response priming the brain for repair. That overlap is not incidental. It's the most neurologically active transition of the entire 24-hour cycle. And it opens and closes every single morning, whether or not you do anything with it. Most people over 60 unknowingly work against both processes at once. And because neither produces an immediate, obvious symptom when disrupted, the cost accumulates invisibly over months and years. A strong coffee on an empty stomach before any water hits the system is one of the most common morning habits among adults over 60. Caffeine at high concentration, absorbed rapidly without food or fluid to slow it, produces a cortisol spike that overshoots the natural awakening response. Instead of riding the neuroplastic window, you're flooding the system with a stress-adjacent hormonal surge that narrows the very opening you needed to use. The brain doesn't get primed for repair. It gets primed for alertness and reactivity, which are different things entirely. That distinction matters more with each passing year, because the window itself becomes less forgiving after 60. Mild dehydration from overnight fluid loss compounds this. Even a 1 to 2% reduction in hydration thickens cerebrospinal fluid dynamics, slows the tail end of glymphatic drainage, and reduces the efficiency of that final clearance push. Most people wake up mildly dehydrated every single morning without realizing it, because the thirst mechanism after 60 becomes less reliable as an early warning signal. The brain is trying to finish its overnight work in a system that isn't giving it what it needs to do so. The composite patient I observed across multiple cases didn't change a complicated routine. She changed the first hour. Water first. Then, within that cortisol awakening window, the specific compound that speaks directly to what the brain is primed to receive. It wasn't just what she consumed, it was the precision of when. Empty stomach, first hour, every morning without a single exception across 60 days. Why does the empty stomach timing matter at the biological level? That answer sits inside the mechanism itself, which is where we need to go next. Nerve growth factor is not a wellness term. It's not something a supplement company invented to put on a label. It's a protein your brain produces to repair neurons, maintain the connections between them, and grow new ones when the conditions are right. If the glymphatic system is the overnight cleaning crew, NGF is the construction foreman who shows up after the cleanup to assess the damage and direct the repair work. When production drops, the damage doesn't get assessed, it just accumulates. Every neuron in your brain relies on a continuous supply of NGF to stay functional. It's what maintains the myelin sheath, the protective insulation wrapped around nerve fibers that determines how fast and how cleanly electrical signals travel between cells. When that insulation is intact, signals move fast and arrive accurately. When it degrades, signals slow down, arrive partially, or don't complete the journey at all. That degradation is not abstract. It's the half-second delay before a word arrives, the sentence that loses its ending. And in adults over 60, it's progressive, meaning every month the repair signal is absent, the structural deficit widens. After 60, NGF production declines, not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily enough that repair jobs get deferred. Minor damage that would have been patched within days starts to accumulate into something more structural. The connections that were once reliable become slow, then inconsistent, then absent. And because there is no threshold symptom, no single morning when the decline announces itself, it runs unaddressed for years, invisible until the testing finally reflects what the biology has been doing the whole time. This is where it gets interesting. For years, researchers working on this specific problem, how to stimulate NGF production inside a brain that has stopped producing enough of it, kept running into the same wall. The molecule itself is too large to deliver from outside. Pharmaceutical attempts to cross the blood-brain barrier with synthetic NGF have failed consistently. What the research actually needed was something small enough to get through and precise enough to trigger the brain's own production machinery from within. That compound exists. It doesn't come from a laboratory. It comes from a fungus that has been growing on hardwood trees for thousands of years, and it wasn't taken seriously by Western neuroscience until researchers began isolating its active components and watching what happened to neurons in their presence. Hericium erinaceus, lion's mane. Inside its fruiting body, the specific part of the mushroom that matters here, there are two classes of bioactive compounds that exist nowhere else in nature: hericenones and erinacines. These aren't vitamins. They aren't general antioxidants. They are small enough molecules to cross the blood-brain barrier, which most compounds cannot do. And once inside, they do something no pharmaceutical currently on the market approved for cognitive decline can do. They stimulate the brain's own NGF production, not synthetic NGF delivered from outside, not a drug that mimics NGF. The brain manufacturing it on signal through its own biological machinery at a rate it hasn't been able to sustain on its own for years. Let me explain why that matters. Synthetic or externally delivered NGF cannot cross the blood-brain barrier effectively. This is actually one of the reasons no pharmaceutical NGF therapy exists. The molecule is too large. The delivery problem has never been solved. What hericenones and erinacines do is bypass that problem entirely by signaling the brain to produce it from within. Every approved drug for cognitive decline works downstream of this, managing symptoms while the source deficit continues. Think of a neuron's signal pathway like an old radio dial that's been slightly knocked off frequency. The station is still broadcasting, the receiver still works, but somewhere between the two, interference has degraded the connection, and what comes through is garbled, incomplete, arriving late. NGF doesn't replace the station or the receiver. It clears the interference and restores the fidelity of the channel between them. Leave the interference long enough, and the channel stops being recoverable. This is also why the MoCA improvement the neurologist called impossible took 60 days rather than 6. NGF-driven repair is not symptomatic relief. It's structural. Remyelination, the actual rebuilding of that insulating sheath around nerve fibers, operates on a biological timeline. A fractured bone doesn't heal because you want it to faster. It heals according to the pace at which the body can lay down new tissue. Neurological repair follows the same logic. 60 days of sustained NGF stimulation produces measurable structural change because the repair has had enough time to actually complete. That's what makes the MoCA jump so difficult for a neurologist to explain through conventional frameworks. A score doesn't improve by 4 points in 60 days through normal aging trajectories. It moves the other direction. The only mechanism that accounts for a reversal of that magnitude in that time frame is actual repair. Not a good day, not a placebo response in a blind study, but the brain rebuilding infrastructure it had been losing for years. No pharmaceutical approved for cognitive decline touches this mechanism. That's not a criticism of medicine. It's a fact about where the research has and hasn't gone. And understanding why it hasn't gone there is something we'll come back to before the end of this video. Knowing the mechanism is not the same as knowing how to use it. Most people who've heard of lion's mane have tried a product that didn't do what they expected, and the reason almost always comes down to form, dose, or timing. Getting any one of those wrong means the hericenones and erinacines that drive NGF stimulation either aren't present in sufficient quantity, aren't absorbed effectively, or aren't hitting the brain during the window when it's most prepared to respond. Start with form, because this is where most products fail before you've even opened the bag. Lion's mane products on the market split into 2 categories: whole fruiting body extracts and mycelium-based products. The fruiting body is the mushroom itself, the visible, above-ground structure. The mycelium is the root system it grows from. Hericenones, the compounds most directly linked to NGF stimulation in human brain tissue, are concentrated in the fruiting body. Mycelium products frequently contain high levels of starch from the grain substrate they're grown on, with relatively low concentrations of the active compounds you're actually looking for. The label won't always make this distinction obvious. Look for whole fruiting body extract explicitly. If it just says mycelium biomass or doesn't specify, assume the active compound concentration is lower than what the clinical trials used. On dose. The clinical trials showing cognitive improvements in adults with mild impairment used daily doses ranging from 500 to over 3,000 milligrams of standardized extract. The composite patient used approximately 750 milligrams per day in a hot morning tea blend, comfortably within the evidence-supported range and consistent with the dosing used in the 2023 double-blind trial that produced significant improvements in memory and processing speed. You don't need to push to the upper limits. Consistency at a moderate dose outperforms intermittent use at a high one. On timing and preparation. The protocol was consumed within the first hour of waking, before food, with water or as a hot tea. The empty stomach matters for two reasons. First, it removes competition from food-bound digestion, allowing the fat-soluble haricinones to be absorbed more directly. Second, and less discussed, hot water extraction actually increases the bioavailability of the active compounds. The heat helps break down the cell wall structures that would otherwise limit how much gets released. This means a hot tea or dissolving the extract into a hot beverage isn't just convenient, it's mechanistically the right preparation method. Adding it to morning coffee after brewing works. Adding it to cold water does not optimize it the same way. The composite patient's neurologist saw the mocha improvement. What the neurologist didn't see was the calendar she kept on her kitchen counter. 60 consecutive mornings, not 58, not 59 with 2 skipped. 60. That's not perfectionism, it's biology. NGF-driven neuroplasticity is a cumulative process. The repair cycle builds on itself day over day, and breaking the signal chain resets the momentum. Missing a few days early doesn't erase everything, but it interrupts the sustained signaling that structural repair depends on. The 60-day timeframe isn't a wellness marketing number. It reflects how long remyelination takes to produce changes measurable on standardized cognitive testing. Before moving forward, a direct note on safety. If you take anticoagulants, warfarin, aspirin therapy, or similar blood-thinning medications, speak with your physician before adding lion's mane, because it has mild, platelet-affecting properties that could interact. If you're currently undergoing chemotherapy, hold off entirely. NGF pathway interactions are still under active research, and the safety picture in that context isn't established. And if you have a known mushroom allergy, this is not the protocol for you. For everyone else, the clinical trial safety record at standard doses showed no significant adverse events. These 3 flags are real, they're worth knowing, and they're the complete list. What you should expect in the first 4 weeks is not transformation. It's subtler than that. Words arriving a fraction faster, less searching in the middle of a sentence. The morning mental fog clearing a little sooner than it used to. Those small shifts are the early signal that the glymphatic NGF system is starting to respond. And they matter because they tell you the protocol is working before the testing can confirm it. The morning protocol only works as well as the night that precedes it. This is the part most discussions about lion's mane leave out entirely, and it's why 2 people can follow the same morning routine and get meaningfully different results. Here's the logic. The glymphatic system runs its clearance work during deep, slow-wave sleep. If that sleep is fragmented, if the system gets interrupted before it can complete a full cycle, the brain arrives at morning carrying the metabolic debris from the night before on top of whatever accumulated during the day. The morning dose of lion's mane stimulates NGF production and signals the brain toward repair. But repair requires raw material. It requires a clean substrate. If the overnight clearance didn't finish, the NGF signal is trying to rebuild on a foundation that hasn't been properly cleared. The mechanism is sound, the conditions undermine it. 3 specific nighttime habits consistently impair glymphatic function in adults over 60, and none of them get discussed in a standard sleep hygiene conversation. The first is bedroom temperature. Most people have never connected this to cognition. The body needs its core temperature to drop by 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit to enter and sustain deep, slow-wave sleep. That drop is not incidental, it's a trigger. Without it, the brain cycles through lighter stages and never fully reaches the depth at which lymphatic clearance runs at full efficiency. A room above 72 degrees prevents that drop from happening completely. The optimal range for full-cycle lymphatic clearance is 65 to 68 degrees. Not for comfort, though most people who try it report sleeping more soundly within a week. For the specific thermal conditions the brain's maintenance system requires to run without interruption. The second is screens within 60 minutes of sleep. Blue light exposure in the hour before bed suppresses melatonin production for the first 3 to 4 hours of the sleep period. Melatonin isn't just a sleep onset signal. It has direct protective effects on cerebral vasculature and plays a supporting role in the fluid dynamics that lymphatic flow depends on. Blunting it means the brain's protective environment during early sleep is compromised. Not enough to feel it acutely, but enough to reduce clearance efficiency across hundreds of nights. The third is alcohol in the evening. This one matters more than most people want to hear. Alcohol produces what's called the acetaldehyde rebound effect as it clears the system, typically in the middle of the night. The brain, initially sedated, swings toward arousal as acetaldehyde metabolizes, fragmenting REM and slow-wave sleep right in the window when the lymphatic system should be running its deepest cycles. People who drink regularly in the evenings often feel like they sleep fine. The subjective experience of falling asleep quickly masks the disruption happening in the architecture underneath. The composite patient made 2 changes at the same time. She started the morning lion's mane protocol, and she dropped her bedroom temperature to 66 degrees. Her neurologist, reviewing the 60-day results, attributed the mocha improvement entirely to the supplement. What he didn't have in front of him was the other half of the picture, that she had simultaneously repaired the conditions under which her brain was doing the actual repair work overnight. That's the compounding effect. Lion's mane provides the signal. NGF responds to that signal, but the structural work, remyelination, synaptic reconstruction, happens during sleep, not during the waking hours when the supplement is absorbed. The morning dose and the night before aren't 2 separate interventions. They're 2 halves of a single protocol. Run one without the other, and you're leaving measurable results on the table. The clinical picture we've built across this video draws from real peer-reviewed data. And before we close, it's worth being precise about what that data actually confirms and where it stops short. You deserve an honest accounting, not a selective one. The most directly relevant trial is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study in adults with mild cognitive impairment, running 3 months of daily lion's mane supplementation against a placebo group. Cognitive function scores, including both memory and processing speed, improved significantly in the treatment group. When the supplementation stopped, those improvements declined within 4 weeks. That finding has been replicated in enough independent studies to take seriously, and the pattern it describes is consistent with what we know about the mechanism. NGF-driven repair requires ongoing signaling to sustain itself, the same way cardiovascular medication requires daily adherence to maintain its protective effect. Discontinue the signal and the repair process slows, then reverses. That last detail is the one most people skip over, so it's worth pausing on. This is not a cure, it is a maintenance protocol. The brain's capacity to sustain repair depends on a continuous biological prompt. 60 days produces measurable structural change. 60 days followed by 6 months of nothing allows that change to erode. Anyone approaching this as a short-term intervention that produces permanent results will be disappointed. And they'll be disappointed because they were working from an incomplete picture of the biology. On the MOCA specifically, a 2-point change is the threshold most neurologists use to define the minimal clinically important difference on that test. A 4-point improvement in 60 days doesn't just clear that bar, it sits well outside the expected range for any naturally occurring pattern in adults over 60 in either direction. MOCA scores in this age group typically drift downward over time, even in cognitively healthy individuals. A 4-point gain moving against that trajectory in the absence of any pharmaceutical intervention is what stopped the neurologist mid-sentence. It doesn't fit the expected curve because it reflects something the curve wasn't designed to accommodate. What the research doesn't yet show is equally worth knowing. Long-term safety data for daily use beyond 6 months at standard doses is limited. The existing trials are promising and their safety profiles are clean, but they're not multi-year longitudinal studies. That's not a reason to dismiss the evidence. It's honest scientific context that you should carry into any decision you make. There's also a complementary line of emerging research worth mentioning briefly. Magnesium L-threonate, a specific form of magnesium designed for enhanced brain bioavailability, shows early evidence for supporting synaptic density and cognitive reserve through a different pathway than NGF stimulation. Some practitioners are beginning to combine it with lion's mane as a paired protocol, reasoning that the two mechanisms address different structural needs without overlapping. The combination hasn't been formally trialed together, and the long-term safety picture for high-dose magnesium threonate has the same gap as lion's mane. Short-term studies exist, multi-year data doesn't yet. If you explore it, do so with a physician who knows your full supplement and medication picture. The honest framing for all of it. Lion's mane works in an earlier window, when the glymphatic system retains enough function to benefit from the signal, and when remyelination is still biologically possible. It won't reverse advanced neurodegeneration. What the evidence supports is intervention before the window closes. And for most people watching this, that window is still open. If the mechanism is real, if the research is peer-reviewed and sitting in PubMed, if the clinical results are the kind that make neurologists go quiet, then the obvious question is why your doctor has never brought it up. The answer isn't complicated, and it isn't a cover-up. But it's worth understanding clearly. Medical school in the United States allocates fewer than 20 hours to nutrition across 4 years of training. Not nutritional neuroscience specifically, nutrition broadly. Everything your physician learned about food, supplementation, and dietary compounds that affect brain function fits into roughly the same number of hours most people spend watching television in a week. That's not a criticism of physicians. It's a structural fact about how medical education prioritizes pharmacology, diagnostics, and procedural training over nutritional biochemistry. Your doctor is exceptionally well trained for the system they were trained within. That system just doesn't include this. The research on hericenones, erinacines, and NGF stimulation is real and it's accessible. It hasn't been translated into clinical practice guidelines because that translation requires a particular kind of funding and momentum. Practice guidelines in conventional medicine change when large-scale randomized trials accumulate enough weight to shift consensus. Those trials require funding. Funding for clinical trials flows primarily from pharmaceutical companies and grant institutions that prioritize patentable outcomes. A mushroom extract that grows on logs and costs a few dollars a dose cannot be patented. There is no financial architecture to support the multi-year, multi-site trial that would move lion's mane from promising peer-reviewed research to standard of care recommendation. That's not conspiracy. It's how the economics of research funding actually work. And understanding it removes the frustration of feeling like something is being withheld from you. Nothing is being withheld. The information exists in the literature. Your doctor simply hasn't had a reason to go looking for it, and the system they practice within hasn't handed it to them. What this means practically is that the conversation has to start with you. Not confrontationally, collaboratively. Bring the studies. Ask your physicians specifically about your glymphatic health. Ask about your sleep architecture and whether fragmented deep sleep might be worth evaluating. Ask for a baseline MOCA so that 60 days from now, you have a number to compare against. Most physicians, when presented with evidence and a patient who is asking the right questions, will engage. That's what happened with the composite patient's neurologist. He didn't dismiss the result. He scheduled a follow-up and asked her to maintain the protocol. That's the right clinical response to an unexpected outcome, and it starts with a patient who arrived prepared. You are not too far into decline for this conversation to matter. The window where NGF stimulation produces measurable structural change is wider than most people assume, and nothing about what I've described today requires a diagnosis to act on. Start the protocol. Get a baseline MOCA if you can. Keep a simple log: word finding speed, morning clarity, how long the fog takes to lift after waking. 60 mornings. Then compare. But before you do, there's one more thing you need to know, because it's already working against you whether or not you're aware of it. There's a specific nutrient deficiency that quietly blocks the same neuroplastic pathways lion's mane is trying to activate. No dramatic symptom, no obvious warning sign. Most people over 60 have it to some degree, and most have never been tested for it. If it's present while you're running this protocol, the NGF signal goes out, and the repair doesn't fully land. The 60 days happen, the results don't. That's what the next video covers. The specific nutrient, the mechanism it blocks, and exactly how to correct it before it costs you the progress you're about to work for. It's on your screen right now. Watch it before you start the protocol, not after.